Today, we are going to learn about how to analyze the complexity of different types of text. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what do we consider with text complexity? According to the Common Core standards, there are four main areas to consider: knowledge, language, structure, and meaning. Before we break these four areas down, I would like you to take a moment and pause this video and read Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. This is linked in your agenda. You may also want to print the four-square matrix example that is also linked in your agenda and use it to follow along. This will be the example text and exemplar that I will use to take you through the analysis of the four areas: knowledge, language, structure, and meaning. Take a moment now to pause this video and read Mother to Son, and if you choose, to print off the four-square matrix example. The first area to consider with complexity is knowledge. Knowledge is considering students' background experiences and their knowledge with the topic or topics of the text. A way to think about this is along a continuum. Does the text have a simple theme, or does it have complex or sophisticated themes? Are there single themes or multiple themes? Obviously, a text with multiple themes is going to be much more complex than a text that simply has one theme. You also want to ask yourself, is this embedded in common everyday experiences for the student, or is the text giving examples of fantastical situations in which students may be more unfamiliar with? Another piece of knowledge to consider is the work being written from a single perspective or multiple perspectives? And finally, when thinking about those perspectives, would the perspective be like the student's own perspective, or something different than theirs, or in opposition to their perspective? Let's take a look at the exemplar. As we take a look at this, I would like you to think about what you read in the poem Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. If it falls to the left of the continuum, we're going to say it's simple. If it falls near the middle or in between, we're going to say it's moderately complex. And if it falls near the right of the continuum, we're going to say it's very complex. So let's take a look first at the themes in this poem. We're going to ask ourselves, is it a simple theme or a complex theme? And are there single themes or multiple themes? So taking a look at this, we would say that this is very complex, based on the fact that the theme itself is complex and that there are multiple themes. The poem is based on the idea of hope and encouragement to move forward in life, despite all difficulties and no matter how tough life may become. It is also a demonstration of another theme of love that a mother has for her son. Behind this love, the poet emphasizes the idea of never giving up in any situation. You can see that this is a deeper theme, a more complex theme, and that there isn't just one theme that the poet is trying to highlight. Therefore, we'd say it's very complex in this area. The next piece to think about is the content of the poem embedded in common everyday experiences or in more fantastical situations. In this case, we're going to say it's moderate, that it falls somewhere in between. The main reason for this is that the metaphor of the crystal stair may seem a little more fantastical, but the difficulty of life may be a common experience. Therefore, it falls more in the middle of the continuum. The next piece is to think about what perspective it is written from, single or multiple. In this case, it is written from a single perspective, the perspective of a mother who loves her son and wants him to persist. So in this area, the poem is simple, not very complex. Finally, we want to consider, is this single perspective likely to link to students' own perspectives or be unlike the student's perspective? In this case, depending on the students in front of you, you may say this is simple to moderate. It's going to be more individualized based on the student's family makeup and dynamic. The next piece of complexity to consider after knowledge is language. When thinking about language, we want to consider the vocabulary, figurative language, and use of dialect or regional language in the text. Some continuums to think about are, is the language being used literal or figurative or ironic? Is the language clear or is it ambiguous or purposefully misleading? Is the language contemporary and familiar or instead archaic and unfamiliar? And finally, does the text include conversational language or language that's more generally academic and domain specific? Let's go back to our exemplar. When thinking about whether it has figurative language and if it's clear or ambiguous, we should do a quick review for ourselves of what figurative language is. Figurative language can include similes, metaphors, and allusions. Similes and metaphors are when we're comparing things to other things, oftentimes things that on the surface may seem one way but are different in another way. This can also include irony, when something seems like something on the surface, but it's different behind the surface. In this case, we would say there is quite a bit of figurative language in this text, and that some of it is very ambiguous. When we think about the comparison between the mother's life and a treacherous staircase, that is quite complex and may not be what is on the surface. When she goes on to say, but all the time I's been a climbing, that demonstrates that despite her hardships and struggles, she keeps moving on and climbing the staircase. She goes on to talk about how she keeps on going in the dark. By this, she means the low moments in her life, where there has been no light. Some of this information could be very ambiguous to students and includes various different kinds of metaphors. The next question to ask yourself around language is the language more archaic and unfamiliar, or is it more contemporary and familiar to students? In this case, much of the language used in the poem is archaic, meaning been used in the past or used in classical examples, and is not very common to present day. For example, there's quite a bit of colloquial language. The vernacular, meaning the language or dialect spoken by ordinary people in a certain part of the country or region, is used throughout the text. The way it is worded gives you the impression that the woman is less educated and possibly from the countryside. Another language move that is made is that there is some alliteration used as well. Alliteration is the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. You can see this a few times in the poem, and one example of this is when she says, "Don't you sit down on the steps," with the D's and the S's having the alliteration. This alliterative language may be uncommon to students, as we may not often intentionally speak in these ways. There's also a device of anaphora used. Anaphora is when a poet deliberately repeats the first part of a sentence in order to achieve an artistic effect. You see that many times sentences are started with "and," or lines are started with "and." This is to emphasize that the mother's life was not ideal, and that idea keeps being brought back over and over and over again. Again, this could be unfamiliar to students, and this device itself may be unknown. Finally, enjambment is used. Enjambment is when there's a continuation of a sentence without a pause. You'll see this multiple times with examples like "and splinters" and "boards torn up." This could be confusing for students if this language is unfamiliar. The final thing to think about with language is the language general and academic, or is it more domain specific? In this case, we would say that the language is more academic, since much of it being used, things like metaphors, similes, alliteration, anaphora, all of these things are very specific to poetry and academic language. We don't use these devices as much in conversational language. After considering knowledge and language, we will want to think about the structure of the text. When thinking about structure, we consider the organization, the text features, the genre structure, and the syntax or sentence structure. We want to find out, is the structure more simple or complex? Are there conventional or unconventional features used? Are the events related in chronological order, or are they out of chronological order? Are the traits of the text common to the genre, or are they specific to a particular discipline? And if there are graphics in the text, are they simple and easy to figure out, or are they more sophisticated? In the example of Mother to Son, the structure of the text varies in its complexity. When thinking about is it simple or complex in general, we would say it's moderately complex. It is a 20-lined poem. In that way, it's simple, but it's complex because there is no regular rhyme or rhythm scheme, as some students may be familiar with in poetry. The next thing to think about is conventional or unconventional features. In this case, we would say it follows conventional features of poetry, so it's more simple. There are lines of poetry, there are 3 stanzas. The poem itself is not long, so we'd say it's more simple on the continuum. The next piece to think about is chronological order. In this case, it's somewhat chronological. However, the mother is reflecting back on her life and then using that to refer to present day. So there's kind of a bit of back and forth. So we'd say it probably falls somewhere in the middle at moderately complex. When thinking about does it have traits common to poetry, we would say yes, indeed it does. Use of imagery, metaphor, repeated lines, and deeper theme. This makes it more simple in this place. Finally, you'll notice that the example that you looked at had one graphic of the staircase. In this case, we'd say this graphic itself is mostly simple. It will help the students literally understand what's being said, but possibly not figuratively. However, in and of itself, it is not difficult to decipher. Finally, when looking at a text, we want to consider the meaning, the layers of meaning, the purpose of the text, and the complexity of the bigger ideas and concepts. We want to ask ourselves, is there a single meaning or multiple levels of meaning? And is the purpose stated by the author, or is it more implicit? In this case, there are multiple levels of meaning. There are themes of hope, encouragement, a parent's love, and persistence. Also, the literal levels of staircase splinters and boards do not point to the implicit meanings of those things. Therefore, we'd say it's very complex, both based on themes and other concepts that come out around what the staircase splinters, boards, and having no carpet would represent. Finally, the purpose is moderately stated. At one point in the poem, the mother does say, "Don't give up." This is one of the main themes of the poem. However, some of the other themes or purposes of love, encouragement, and hope are much more implicit. After you've considered each of these 4 areas, you will want to write a conclusion about the text as a whole. You want to talk about how complex you believe it is as a whole and why, what areas you'd possibly emphasize, and then suggest instructional strategies. Take a moment to read the conclusion again, either from the link or from what you copied off. Overall, we said this was moderately to very complex, and the teacher was somewhat surprised by this. You can see here how she talks about what she will emphasize, some of those things being metacognitive and purposeful about text complexity. She wants to scaffold the text structure, the language, the purpose, and the knowledge demands, meaning that there was something in all 4 areas that needed a little more focus for students. Finally, this teacher suggested some instructional strategies. You can take a look at those here, and if you're confused about what those are, there is a link in your agenda to some of Zweier's examples of what you might use. Notice how in the conclusion, the teacher talks about what pieces of complexity these strategies would meet. Be sure to think about this when you analyze your own text. Now it's your turn to try it. Decide on a text that you will teach soon with students. Analyze the complexity for all 4 areas, draw your overall conclusions, and consider some instructional strategies to support your students. There are more directions for you in the agenda.